if the Americans think that there is a point to the Russians talking to the Ukrainians have no choice but to go along and go to those talks and show some kind of willingness to reach a deal, and then highlight the fact that the Russians are not willing to do it. And the one thing that Sergei Kislitsa said, which was very interesting, was that he could tell that it was pointless negotiating with these people because they had a diktat from Putin and they had no leeway to negotiate or change or discuss arguments. They just had a position that they had to stick to.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot, and we are joined today by the Times' Ukraine correspondent, Maxim Tucker. Maxim is recently back from Ukraine, where he's sent regular dispatches from the front line since 2022. Maxim, good to see you again. Thanks for joining us. Ukraine's negotiator, Rustem Umerov, is due to meet US Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner in Florida later today. We are talking on Thursday, 10 o'clock in the morning, UK time. Anything could happen in the coming hours. Is there any point after the futilities, though, of the fruitless trip to Moscow by the US delegation?
Well, we haven't heard a proper debrief from the Americans on what was discussed during those 5 hours, which is a long time with Putin. Obviously, they came back empty-handed, but there may have been, they both talked about it, the talks being constructive. So maybe there are some things they feel they can work on that they can push the Ukrainians into accepting. And certainly the Ukrainians will be very keen to hear firsthand what happened in those talks. Rustem Umerov is an interesting character. He's got a kind of dual role here. He's also responsible for trying to extract munitions from the US and to try and get weapons out of them. So he's more likely to be agreeing these kind of territorial concessions or draft territorial concessions than perhaps the rest of the Ukrainian government. And I think that's what we saw in the first round of discussions, where he is reported to have worked on this draft 28-point peace plan with Witkoff and with Kirill Dmitriev, the Kremlin's envoy.
But when Ukraine's foreign minister told Putin to stop wasting the world's time, do you think he has a point?
I think it's clear that Putin is not prepared to accept anything that allows Ukraine to be sovereign and independent. And if he does accept anything, it's only to give more territorial, grab more territory from Ukraine and allow a kind of a better launch pad for future attacks. I think, he is clearly set on his maximalist goals, which are subjugating Ukraine entirely, and that's not going to stop. I think, they are playing for time with the Americans. They are trying to show the Americans that they are willing to engage in peace talks simply so that the Americans don't have a reason or an obligation to provide more weapons to Ukraine.
And at this moment, do you think the Ukrainians can actually achieve anything through diplomacy?
I mean, Ukraine has to play this game. It has no choice. It's really reliant on the Americans still for intelligence sharing. The American satellite simply can't be replaced by the Europeans. There is no other support that they can rely on for that. So they have to do everything that the Americans expect them to do, and that is the peace negotiation. I don't think anyone in Ukraine believes that they're going to get a meaningful settlement out of Putin, but they've got to play along with this game that Trump and Witkoff seem to want to play.
Of course, and Putin was emboldened by his belief, or at least his claims of successes on the battlefield in Ukraine before that visit to Moscow by Witkoff and Jared Kushner. He was talking it up, and he would do, wouldn't he? What is the reality around Pokrovsk and Vovchansk on the battlefield?
Well, let's deal with Vovchansk first. I mean, let's talk about what Vovchansk is. It's a border town of 27,000 people right on the Russian border. And the Russian army has been trying to capture this place since May 2024. So it doesn't speak volumes about Russia's success on the battlefield that they are now crowing about the success of taking Vovchansk. And even so, they don't seem to have taken the entire town. There are still pockets that are under Ukrainian control. They certainly haven't advanced around and encircled the town in the ways that they have in other cities. So it is not much to boast about, really. Pokrovsk is more important. It is the kind of last major settlement on the road into Pavlograd, which is a really, really important industrial base for the Ukrainians. And if the Russians do succeed in completely taking control of Pokrovsk, that means that the Ukrainians end up having to kind of defend in the fields rather than in settlements against the next Russian attack. I mean, it does look like the end is inevitable in Pokrovsk. There are Ukrainians still in Pokrovsk. They are still fighting there on the kind of northern outskirts of the town. And there is a kind of big garrison in Mirnograd as well. But, the Russians have raised the flag in the center of the city. They've done that before. I think it's too soon to be saying, there's absolute victory in Pokrovsk, but it does look like that in the end is inevitable.
And really also important really to say that we've been talking about this for a few weeks now. So the defense of Pokrovsk has been strong by the Ukrainians.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been fierce. And again, it's a battle that's lasted nearly a year and a half for the Russians to take a kind of mid-sized town. It isn't something that the Russian army should be so proud of. But you can see that, Putin announcing this in military uniform, he's much more willing to be associated with the war now because he thinks it's going well. Before he was staying quite aloof from it, but he's appeared a few times now in military uniform announcing these victories, as he calls them. I think he's quite happy with how the war is going. And that's another reason why the Americans should realize that Putin is not prepared to come to the peace table, because he thinks the war is going his way finally. And the Americans need to reverse that if they expect him to be serious about talking peace.
Can we just now talk about some of the detail of one of your recent dispatches? Because I know our audience really likes hearing the detail of what you've experienced and what you've seen. And in a recent article, you wrote about a successful naval operation launched by Ukraine to attack Russian ports across the Black Sea and in Crimea. Can you tell me about this mission? It was on the 21st of September, wasn't it?
Yes, that's right. So this is a really critical mission that had previously gone unreported. It was a secret mission by Ukraine's military intelligence. And now obviously Ukraine has had success in driving Russia's Black Sea fleet out of the Black Sea, really to take harbor along the Russian mainland in ports like Novorossiysk, because of these naval drones that the Ukrainians have used so effectively against the Russian Black Sea fleet. And that's mean they haven't got the same kind of radar scanning abilities, the same kind of ability to see what's happening on the Black Sea as they once had. So they've tried to install them on these gas platforms, which are known as the Boyko Towers, in kind of in the middle of the Black Sea between Crimea and Odessa. And they had been quite effective in being able to anticipate Ukrainian attacks and scan all the way up into the southern coast of Ukraine and see what was taking off, what is approaching the coastline. And that had made it complicated for the Ukrainians. So they launched this very daring naval raid with two different types of drones. There's new Katran drones and the Maguras, which we've already become familiar with, sinking Russian ships. And in quite a complicated raid on these towers, they attacked with these Katrans, which are kind of like mini aircraft carriers. They carry FPV drones and fixed-wing aircraft type drones, and they can also carry torpedoes. And so these drones approached the oil tower from one direction. They launched a decoy into the air, which attracted two Russian jets to try and shoot it down. And while those Russian jets were distracted, they made a kind of 100-kilometer arc around to the other side of the towers. They launched torpedo type drones, which have a kind of 50-kilometer range, towards the towers. And these torpedo drones impacted the towers, they also attacked with the FPV and aircraft type drones, hitting the Marines stationed on the towers, but also taking out these radar facilities.
It was an ingenious piece of planning, wasn't it? Who did you get to talk to who was involved?
So we talked to the commander of this Unit 9. He's a commander of the Black Sea Legion, which are using these Katran drones. And he told us in detail. They showed us video about how they conducted the operation. We also got to see these drones on the water and how they work. And it was fascinating the way that these drones, they're also trained using AI. We saw how that was working. They had pictures from Dagestan TV, which is, a Russian propaganda channel, showing Russian naval vessels, and they were training the AI using this video from, and you could see the AI recognizing if it was an enemy vessel or if it was a civilian vessel or if it was unknown, with red boxes or green boxes or white boxes or yellow boxes appearing over these vessels. And the technology at work in these places, it's astonishing. So you have a special forces unit that's kind of embedded in a Miltech startup company. In one room, they have mission planners. In the next room, they have 3D printers churning out components.
What can you tell us about the Katrans that were used? How many were used, and how robust are they when they're going on that kind of operation?
So they just launched two Katrans. So they had an X1 and an X3, which are able to launch these aircraft. They've now got a different type of Katran called the Venom, which has a minigun on the front of it. It's got a Browning machine gun on top that can engage aerial targets, and it's also got these torpedoes fixed underneath the wings, so they can engage targets at sea from a distance. They're pretty fast. They go almost 100 kilometers an hour, despite all these heavy armaments. They're very, very maneuverable, and they have a very low profile, so it makes it difficult for the Russians to see them on the water. They are advanced in terms of the technology that is packed into them. They have all kinds of different sensors that tells the team operating them how the Katran is doing, if it's taking on too much water, if it gets damaged, and it also has a munitions loadout, so you can see on a kind of heads-up display how many aircraft you have, and the AI can help you determine what's the best course of action. If you have a target that you need to attack, the likelihood of success of these different planes getting through, how many you should use, it can advise on all of that.
Do you get a sense that this is being used more widely then by the Ukrainians, these kind of tactics?
Definitely, I think AI is the next thing that is coming into Ukrainian forces drones. It's easier to use it on the sea because targets are more recognizable, they're bigger, it's more difficult to make a mistake and have friendly fire hit a civilian vessel. So this is definitely the forefront, the cutting edge of the technology war, and I think we're going to see it deployed more and more often.
So just going back to the 21st of September, then they took out the radars using the sea drones, and then this made way for the Magura drones to attack Russia on the mainland. Is that right? Talk me through it.
Right. So the Magura fleet were then able to attack the Russian port of Novorossiysk, and there were some videos we could see of them impacting oil loading and gas loading facilities in that port and destroying them. And there were also then the FPV attacks on the street, and there's been continued attacks since. So taking out this radar allowed the Maguras to get all the way. It's a much greater distance, obviously, from the southern Ukrainian coast all the way around Crimea to Novorossiysk. But having these radar stations taken out, the Ukrainians have been able to strike again and again and again, and they've also had more success with their deep strike drones flying over the sea and attacking Novorossiysk. But it's not just Novorossiysk. We've also seen more and more intense attacks on Crimea. We've seen AN-26 transport planes being attacked and destroyed in Crimea since that radar was taken out. We've seen experimental aircraft in Russia taken out, more and more air defenses and helicopters and standby on Crimea taken out as well. So it's had a huge impact on the war in the Black Sea theatre.
And so how well equipped are the Russian forces to stop them?
So the Russians obviously have their countermeasures. They've been trying to use planes to destroy them. They've been trying to use drones as well to attack these the naval drones as they come into the surface. But you see, because they're quite cheap and effective, and they have these AI capabilities, and they predict, how to best anticipate the Russian defenses and defeat them, it's getting harder and harder for the Russians. So some drones inevitably get through. Now, obviously, the next stage of that is the Russians trying to develop better countermeasures, and then the Ukrainians will develop again better ways of attacking. So it's this cat and mouse game. But at the moment, the Ukrainians are doing really, really well with this in the Black Sea.
And really interesting that you never really hear President Putin talking about what's happening in the Black Sea.
Right, there's no reason for him to talk about it. It's embarrassing that they have this huge, expensive Black Sea fleet, which has basically had to hide itself on the Russian coastline.
Mm. So as you say, Ukraine's had extraordinary success against the Russian Navy in the Black Sea using its uncrewed surface and underwater vessels. How has that interdicted the Russians' ability to move any vessels in the Black Sea, be it civilian or otherwise?
Right, so now they've started hitting these oil and gas port facilities in Novorossiysk, which is a really important trading hub for the Russians. It's a really important exporting oil and gas place. But we've also seen the Ukrainians start to attack sanctioned tankers on the Black Sea. So these are Western sanctioned tankers, and damaging them pretty severely, and obviously damaging the kind of the engine and the steering abilities. Now, these are civilian vessels. They're Gambia flagged, but they're part of the Russian Black Sea fleet. Yet they're used, obviously, to help amass money for Putin's war chest. So it's controversial. It's a controversial tactic to attack this shipping in the Black Sea. But it is obviously demonstrating Ukraine's determination to attack the source of funding for Russia's war machine and really make it um, difficult and punish the Russians, especially in the kind of oligarchs' pockets, for prosecuting this war in Ukraine.
And do you think this signals an intent to widen the scope for attacks on Russian shipping?
I think so. I think this is a warning signal that if you continue to send tankers, sanctioned tankers through the Black Sea, we are going to start taking them out. And I think it's also an encouragement for the West to do more because obviously these sanctioned tankers are still sailing around the world. They still go through the English Channel all over the world, and they're not stopped by any international powers. So they're stopped sometimes if they're suspected of being involved in sabotaging undersea cables, but they're not stopped simply for carrying oil, even though they're sanctioned. And I think Ukraine is frustrated by that and is starting to take matters into its own hands.
Having said that, the Ukrainians have been quite careful, haven't they, to choose their targets?
They have been careful, they very clearly ships that were already sanctioned. They're not just any old ship that's going through the Black Sea and using the Novorossiysk ports. They also seem to take caution to make sure they didn't hit a full oil tanker, which would cause a lot of environmental damage and be controversial. But there's always the risk of mistakes being made in this kind of warfare, and I think it's something that Ukraine wants the West to take notice. All of this money is still pouring into Putin's war chest at a time when Europe says that it realizes the importance of Ukraine standing up for the rest of Europe. So what is Europe going to do about interdicting these Russian vessels?
Away from the battlefield and from what's going on at sea, you've got this fascinating insight in one of your recent reports into the political negotiating tactics of the Russians and the Ukrainians from a Ukrainian diplomat who took part in the Istanbul negotiations in May. It seems that many, as the talks go on right now, that you can get an insight from what he told you about what's happening at the moment.
Right. So the Russian attitude to the Ukrainians at the negotiating table is still that you don't exist as a nation, you're not real. And they said that it's Sergei Kislitsa. He's the first deputy minister of foreign affairs, and he's been tasked with the negotiating track, the peace talks track. He's been in the room with the Americans recently as well, and negotiating. You see his face pretty prominently in most of these discussions. And he told us about Istanbul and how the Russians opened with a kind of history speech, which set out how Russia and Ukraine was all one nation. It was a kind of contorted propaganda history speech. And then at the end, they said, so look, you see that we, the Russians, are killing Russians. We don't want that. And obviously speaking to a Ukrainian, a full kind of bench of Ukrainian generals, Ukrainian intelligence officers, Ukrainian diplomats, just denying straight off that they exist. And he said that they knew that they were prepared for that to happen, so they didn't engage with that at all. They just went straight to their agenda and trying to ensure that there was a ceasefire along the current lines of conflict. And the Russians simply would not agree to a ceasefire in any terms. The only thing that they would agree to is a few-hour truce to collect the dead.
And they went in with their eyes wide open. They wanted an unconditional ceasefire. They knew the Russian delegation would try show willing, but in reality offer nothing at all. I mean, did they feel then they had no choice but to go along with it, as you said right at the beginning, they're doing now?
I think absolutely. If the Americans think that there is a point to the Russians talking to the Ukrainians have no choice but to go along and go to those talks and show some kind of willingness to reach a deal, and then highlight the fact that the Russians are not willing to do it. And the one thing that Sergei Kislitsa said, which was very interesting, was that he could tell that it was pointless negotiating with these people because they had a diktat from Putin and they had no leeway to negotiate or change or discuss arguments. They just had a position that they had to stick to. And he said that they were also wary that other people in the Russian delegation might report back on them. So all of them were trying to defend in the strongest possible way Putin's original position and not have any kind of compromise, which makes it obviously impossible to negotiate if you're not negotiating for the person who makes all the decisions is not in the room.
And did you get to meet him in person, this man?
I met him in person in Kiev. Yeah.
And how did he strike you?
Well, he was erudite. He was an interesting intellectual guy. I think he was very pragmatic. He was realistic about the chances of success, but he understood the importance of these talks. He also understood the Americans pretty well because he was the Ukrainian ambassador to the UN. He's been living in New York. And he is also the man who was responsible for kind of generating the initial wave of support for Ukraine in the UN after the initial invasion in 2022.
Must have been a very interesting meeting. Just to touch on something else we were talking about last time, the Ukrainian government grappling with this corruption scandal over its energy sector. The latest casualty, President Zelensky's chief of staff, Andriy Yermak, who was forced to resign less than a week ago. Do you think the crisis has calmed down now?
Well, I think this is a seismic shift in Ukraine's government. Andriy Yermak had been kind of the number two to the president. People called him the vice president. Although he's unelected, he had a huge amount of power, and he was holding meetings with the G7 ambassadors instead of Zelensky when they were expecting to have a meeting with Zelensky. So I think it is a really, really big shift. It will be difficult, I think, for Zelensky to find a manager who he trusts in the same way and pulls the levers in the same way as Yermak. Um, I think, there's a potential, it's possible for Zelensky to go from here and dramatically improve the governments of Ukraine. He could rely more on his cabinet, which is the way that the Ukrainian constitution is designed to operate. The prime minister should have more presence, more power, more say. But it has also had the interesting effect of fracturing Zelensky's party and support for him within his own party. So I think Zelensky had to get rid of Yermak in order to try and consolidate support among his political party. But where he goes from here, we've seen the tendency to be very, very stubborn, very obstinate. Sometimes that's admirable, when he talks about I don't need a ride, I need ammunition. That's that kind of determination is what we come to know about Zelensky. But also there's a stubbornness, the stubbornness to not give up, not withdraw from Bakhmut, not withdraw from Pokrovsk or Miraharad when it's past time to do so. And also holding on to Andriy Yermak when he was at the center of so many controversies for so long. This is an opportunity for him to reboot the government, but let's see what he does.
And there is also a suspicion that even though he has gone, that he may still be whispering in President Zelensky's ears because they were very close, weren't they?
They were very close, and that's often the way that it works in Ukraine. You have a kind of somebody in a formal position of power, and then you have a grey cardinal who is outside position of power. And obviously, a role like that where he was managing so many processes, I think there has to be some kind of handover. So I think what you want to see now is that Zelensky appoints a new chief of staff who has authority, who has a clear vision, who is not going to be overshadowed by his predecessor, but also that more power is placed and more responsibility is placed in the hands of the cabinet.
Yeah, and he hasn't announced anyone yet, has he? It's taking some time.
He hasn't announced, or there's been talk actually about Sergei Kislitsa, who we talked about taking on that role, which I think would be a negative move because again, it's showing that you're having somebody who taking them out of a kind of a cabinet position and putting them into the president's office and showing how important the president's office is. And there's also been talk of the prime minister becoming his chief of staff, which shows, exactly the problems with the Ukrainian system at the moment. The prime minister is constitutionally the powerful person in Ukraine, but Zelensky has hoarded power in the presidential office. And if the prime minister goes to become his chief of staff, then that just shows that there is this kind of amalgamation of power which is concentrated in the hands of one person.
So just finally, Maxim, do you think at this stage President Zelensky still has the command of authority necessary to make what might be some very difficult decisions in the coming days? Does he have his politicians and his country behind him?
Well, I think there's no one else still, and there's no sense of there being elections anytime soon. There's no kind of credible threat to his power base. I think he's definitely lost some authority, and he has to placate members in his party who are thinking about one day about elections coming. And we've also seen people start to kind of poke away at his authority. Valery Zaluzhny, the UK ambassador and the former chief of the general staff, obviously is considered a potential rival to Zelensky, has also been talking about the need for political change in Ukraine. And I know personally that there are lots of people who are preparing for elections in Ukraine, even though there are no sign of them. So it's encouraging people to think about the future after Zelensky, but how the mechanism for that happening is still very unclear.
Maxim, it's been great speaking to you. Thank you very much for your time.
Good to talk to you.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio. If you'd like to know more about the war in Ukraine, you can subscribe and sign up for a membership. You can also get more analysis by listening to Times Radio or read thetimes.com. But for now, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.